All right. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm very delighted to invite Nikhil Govind, to do a session with us on Muktibodh. Thank you, Anshuman, who's going to be the moderator for today's session. Welcome all my colleagues in Janki, Devi and other colleges and their students. I'm not going to take up too much time. Anshuman will do the formal introduction, will introduce Nikhil. Anshuman is an old friend, is a colleague who teaches in the Singh College. And now I hand over the session to Anshuman. Thank you.
Thank you, Antara. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, thanks, Antara and the entire Janki Devi staff. It's a wonderful to be back again. Janki Devi has been really kind to me. I've been invited quite often, sometimes as a talker or sometimes even as a moderator. So it's great to be back again. So thanks again. And so we have a new syllabus now, and we have a new poem by Gajanan Madan Muktibodh, and we have a great speaker in our midst to attend to this entire area, because not only that he has done extensive work on Hindi literature, but he's also one of the translators of Muktibodh. And let me tell you, Muktibodh is one of the most difficult poets to translate, not because merely of the kind of language that he uses, the kind of poetic diction he has, but also the formal aspects of his verse, which is very difficult to translate in a language like English. So I welcome Nikhil Govind. He's Professor Head, Associate Professor Head, Center for Humanities, Manipal Academy of Higher Education. And he's a highly qualified person. I had an experience of his great erudition in my MPhil days only. When I shared some courses with him. And after that, we lost contact because I think he went to teach various places maybe, and then he also went to do his PhD from Berkeley, and then he's teaching currently at the Center for Humanities Manipal. And not only that, he has worked extensively on Hindi literature, especially the Hindi novel. I was trying to go through his book that's called Between Love and Freedom, the Revolutionary in Hindi Literature, in which he kind of traces the revolutionary figure in a kind of interstitial space between thinkers on revolution like Gandhi and thinkers, the quote-unquote revolutionary thinkers like Bhagat Singh. And his latest book has also come out and published in 2019, which is called Inlays of Subjectivity, Affect and Action in Modern Indian Literature. He has also authored an interesting monograph on, again, it's called Hindi Modernism, Again Its Times. I've not gone through that. My familiarity with Hindi literature is primarily through either people whom I met because I was part of certain Hindi circles in my hometown, and also there was a lot of Hindi magazines, what we call Laghu Patrika, that used to come, in my hometown, and I used to look through them. And the world of Hindi is a world in apart. There's a lot going on which we don't know anything about. Of course, being in English, after some time, I kind of lost kind of touch with that kind of world, the world of Laghu Patrika, and the kind of extensive criticism of Hindi literature. In fact, in the Hindi world, there are two kinds of Hindi world. One is the Hindi world of the teachers of Hindi, in universities. That's one kind of world. And there's the world of writers and critics, and that's a different world altogether. Sometimes the two overlap also. It's possible that they sometimes overlap, but generally they don't. The Hindi world, generally inhabited by teachers and lecturers and professors, is a bit conservative compared to the kind of writers and the kind of conversation that happens between these writer critics that have kind of read in these Laghu Patrikas. And it's fascinating actually to see the development of the Laghu Patrika itself. And My acquaintance with Muktibodh came first, when I came across an unfinished novel of Muktibodh in an old magazine that got published in 1975, at the time of emergency, basically. And this was unfinished novel. Muktibodh basically is known as a poet and also a short story writer and a diarist. He has a wonderful book called Sahityaki Diary. And he's one of the few Hindi writers at that period who had a very kind of internationalist way of dealing with the world. He wrote extensively on national as well as international affairs. And not only that, he focused on political problems, but he also focused on the aesthetic problems of Hindi literature post, let's say, Premchand kind of world that developed in the late 1950s and 60s. He, of course, died in the 1960s. In 1964, he was no more. And most of his poems remained unpublished till his death. Also only after that, the famous copy of Chand Ka Mutedha was published. And some of his books, in fact, one of his books was banned actually, Bharat Itihaso Sanskriti, and he was deeply perturbed by it in the 1960s. These are the certain things that I know about Muktibodh, and I use these things to. I used to teach this paper, and the two poems, Ek Arup Shunya Ki Prati and Main Tum Logon Se Dur Ho, was there. Brahma Rakshas, of course, is a different deal altogether, and I saw Nikhil's translation. It's a brilliantly done translation with a lot of nuances being brought in. Muktibodh's nuances are very difficult to capture because he uses words in a very, very interesting way. It was more like Milton using Latin. English, in a highly Latinate way. So I always feel that, the kind of syntactic arrangement that Muktibodh has is a very interesting kind of feel to it. Nikhil will tell us more about it. So I give mic to Nikhil now, and let's see what he has to say about Muktibodh. The title is simply On Muktibodh, so I expect him to travel extensively on Muktibodh. Yes, Nikhil.
Yeah, thank you, Anshuman, and thanks everyone who's invited me for this talk. It's actually a great joy to meet a lot of old friends and faces, even if only virtually. And I think I'm very happy and honored to be in this company. It's really a meeting. It's in a strange way, the pandemic has actually recreated some old communities. A lot of people I'm talking to more now than I did before because of Zoom and Google Meet, and so I'm very happy to be part of this conversation. So I'm happy to repeat in case things are not clear. I might also use the chat box because there will be names, and later on they might. I don't know. I hope that if it gets saved, then those names are useful, the other scholarships and all of that. And I wanted really to be informal. I think that was the only request I'd made to Dr. Antra. And I said that, this is really like a conversation. And I'm also thankful to Dr. Dhananjay, who said he wants to also discuss, the pedagogy and some of the institutional, like how to teach modern Indian literature. So, I have, I'll frame the talk. I won't talk for long. I want more time for sort of conversation, and I want, I just want to give you some context. If I talk about myself a little bit, it's only vis-a-vis the, talking about Muktibodh in this particular project. So this translation actually happened as things tend to do, actually sort of by chance. There was a poetry journal, which Almost Island, and some of you all might know it. They just asked me to translate. I was actually trying to remember the context of why, but I've lost that email ID now. So I don't know why I was initially asked to translate it. And then even though I was working on the sort of mid-century Hindi literature, it was really on the novel, and it was on Agyay, Jainendra, Yashpal were the three sort of figures. And in many people's heads, I'll talk a little bit about Hindi literature later. I don't know my audience fully, but it was very much in the context of novelistic prose, and so I wasn't used to I had no real experience translating poetry. And I was asked to do it. And so I thought I'll do it, even though it was literally the last year when I was writing up for the PhD. And it, I think there are a few experiences that have been so rewarding, but also the phrase that actually came to mind was almost like a Muktibodh phrase. I felt my brain was bleeding because it was actually very, very hard to do. It's a difficult language. I had to use the McGregor dictionary still is important. This is so it was. I don't want to. I don't want this talk to be at all about in this, even though it's called on Muktibodh, in the spirit of any kind of expert on this, right? It's more about what I want to really frame it is in terms of a lot of institutional pedagogical issues, also in terms of how do we look at Indian literature as a whole? Because now there's a kind of, I suppose, maybe common sense, maybe political correctness. I, for one, am very glad I was, if I didn't remember it was 1999 that the syllabus got changed, but all of us did, we did all of our Chaucer and all of that. And I'm happy to have done that. But I'm also happy that it has changed and there's a lot more Indian literature. And I've had now experience of, teaching it in Manipal. So I feel this is where the scholarship is going. And so, it's a bit of a no-brainer to have this kind of scholarship. But it's sort of easy to make a pivot from saying we'll only study, Dryden or whatever, canonical English literature, which, like I said, God bless all of them. But, and then you suddenly turn around and you say, okay, let's teach Indian literature. And it's not, it's something that is not so easy to teach, as a lot of people find out. Because what is nice to teach about, if I had to teach, George Eliot or someone, is there's a whole library of scholarship on this, right? Whereas it is only being generated now. So I think it's in that sense and sort of exciting time for, since I'm told that there are many, the majority of people here maybe are students. I just want to say that for those who are interested in contemporary Indian literature, and no matter what your language skills or what your, because these are things that can be learned, it's actually a very sort of exciting time, at least to study it, to produce scholarship on it. So I think that is, so I look at it favorably. I look at it, positively, instead of just bemoaning the fact that there is so little done. So even on someone like Muktibodh, there is so little done, right? There's not even like a proper biography, as far as I know, and very little scholarship. I suspect if one goes to the Hindi departments, there might have been more like archival work, I assume, and the sort of the magazines that Anshuman mentioned. I think those were the mainstay of the Hindi literary world from the late 19th century onwards. So how to think about this is beyond just some sort of pride in it. It's actually something quite difficult, right? To actually teach it. It's like all of my students now want to do, papers on K-pop or something, and I'm like, fine, but actually it's very hard to do papers on things like that, right? It's much easier to do. It's much easier to do work on something that has been actually, there's been generations of thinking on, right? So I want to think about it in that sort of spirit. So I don't know the details of, I've been told that now it's sort of a compulsory paper or something, and you have to sort of, my translation is inflicted on you. So I should apologize, I suppose. But, it is flattering, it's wonderful. And when I first agreed to do that translation, actually, in a very naive way, I said, sure, I'll try. But actually, it seems particularly naive to think about it now, because uh, I actually said yes precisely because it was poetry, which seems a very odd thing to say. But I said, no one's really translated this properly, or maybe there were a few and I didn't, I guess, like it too much. But I thought that, whatever I do will be better than, one is better than zero. And, surely people will come and improve on it. So, and there's something about poetry because, just the beauty of it, right? The words can mean so many different things. And, with Muktibodh, who uses difficult words, I'll talk about language later, but, because if line 5 has a difficult word, you're not sure what it means. A line, depending on what you choose in line 5 impacts what you choose on line 6. And, it can go in very different directions. It's like a tree, right? You take one path and you can go somewhere else. You take another path, you go somewhere else. So those things were precisely what was attractive to me about it, because it was difficult. And I assumed I would just get a lot of things wrong, and I probably have, and other people will do a better job. So because it was poetry, because it seemed such a foolhardy, impossible sort of quest, I thought, let's do it, right? What's there to lose? It's a poetry magazine. Very few people read poetry magazines. And so let me just try. And what I felt was I certainly enjoyed it. It was incredible experience. And I knew it sounded good in English, which is, maybe a quarter of the battle won. But um, but I didn't know, and I fully assumed that a lot of people would find a lot of mistakes. I'm sure there are mistakes, and could do a much better job. So I think even as part of the craft of reading it and teaching it, people should do their own translations. So when I teach here, I'm going to intersperse with some of my teaching experiences here, because I've been asked to also talk about it, and I'm actually interested in talking about it. We do a lot of reading in all the languages. So even the class here has people from obviously all over the country. So even if someone is reading something, you have to get used to hearing Indian languages. I keep saying that. So somebody reads a page in Telugu and very few of us understand it. That's fine. You have to get used to orally, right? AURAL, that oral. I think that experience of working, especially with poetry, is really important. So we just spend a lot of time reading, and then someone translates in a kind of impromptu fashion, and that's fine. And someone like Muktibodh is really, to my mind, to be heard, right? So people should read, especially if you're in Delhi. I think it's fair. People should just read it out, because it also has. So these are things that are hard to translate, because he has that very kind of. It's like he's talking to you. It's like, hey man, that kind of. That's the tone, right? It's not this, not from this very lofty kind of esoteric space. It's actually very much like we're walking on the street, there are two people, and there's this feeling of direct address. And things like that are actually very hard to translate, right? So those qualities are more subtle. I can find words in a dictionary, but I can't find tone. I can't find, of course, humor or sarcasm or informality, or I can't find all of these things. So you've got to work with it. And, like I said, I could have misunderstood a lot of things. So there should be many more sort of translations. And actually, that essay that I had done, sorry, the translation I had done was accompanied by an essay. And, I think I tried to find it. And, this is the thing, when you publish online, everything seems to vanish. I couldn't quite access the essay, but I discussed some of these things about tone, and I think I discussed it because it was so fresh then, about tone and humor and things like that you can't really translate. Like, how do you translate a sort of, if he does dot 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 and there's a silence or an ellipsis, that notion of silence may for you not be in that line, but in the next line, right? Because if just the number of words in Hindi may be not, if 3 words in Hindi, you can always translate into 3 words in English. And so there has to be ways of communicating sort of silence or the density of language, differentially in different spaces, right? So those were things that I enjoyed grappling with. Also, because I was working with Agye, and even though Agye, and I was looking at his prose work, he was a poet primarily, and saw himself as that. And so I would, and Shekhar was the novel. So you can see again, there's a lot. It's a very poetic kind of prose, and so these are hard to translate. Shekhar, by the way, now is translated by Snehal Shingavi. Very lovely translation. You should all read it. I think to really understand the milieu, you should just read as much of that time, at least the primary text. Right? You should read Hindi literature of that period of the 40s, 50s, 60s. Read the prose if poetry is not available. The poetry would probably be the last thing to be translated, but that's how it is. So there was another book in his centenary, 1917. He was born, so 2017. Dr. Apurvanand, some of you all might know, from the Hindi department in Delhi University. So he sort of asked me to write, and I'll discuss some of that towards the end of this talk. So I'd written an article for that, and I discussed where Muktibodh stood in the sort of tradition, right? Okay. The main scholar, I think, in the Anglophone world who's working on it is someone called Greg Golding. So I'll do it on the chat box. Just people have access to it later. And a colleague of mine actually worked quite a lot on Muktibodh. So something I want to talk, maybe I'll get a better sense in the conversation because I got fragments from, Anshuman and uh, was just that I guess in Delhi University, you're not teaching secondary literature, you just teach the primary texts. And so this is a complicated conversation. I don't know if maybe I'm wrong. I would personally, at least, I certainly teach a lot of by the third year for sure, we teach scholarship too. I feel that's kind of important to sort of get it. That is, the students also read it, not just me coming and then sort of giving the information. So I'd like to very much hear how this is happening in Delhi University, but I would certainly encourage it because you'd get a very good sense of the milieu if you read, say, Priyamvada Gopal or people like that. You'd get a sense of the progressive writers. You'd get a sense of the emergence of IPTA, and this is the kind of basic historical context. I'm sure you all are communicating that in class, but I think when students also tend to engage, and because students are different, some actually respond to. Unfortunately, as scholars, we end up being more on the side of the secondary rather than the primary literature, and we don't want to lose that feeling for literature. But I think you have to, you can't understand the poetry without understanding something of the milieu historically, but also formally and all of that. So I looked at the paper that this poem comes in, and I'm looking at the, I'm sure it was, much blood has been shed on getting that syllabus to where you all want it. But of course, when you teach it, and maybe in a place like Delhi University also, because it's such a public and, important institution, there's some pressure of a certain kind of, I don't know what to say, except a kind of tokenism. You have to represent all languages and all of that. And again, that's something to think about pedagogically and institutionally, like how do we teach, say, let's say modern Indian literature without it just being, but this language has to be represented, or this community has to be represented, things like that. So when I looked at, if you look at someone like Muktibodh, I'd want, those kind of questions also emerge. He's very interesting also just at a personal level, like in some sense, Hindi, Marathi, these are very important languages for him. And so how does one, when one is teaching it in translation, communicate that actually it's not just Hindi, but Marathi is so important for him, for example, right? So this is actually, it's not a tangential question. To me, it's of the essence of the kind of poetry he writes. So I heard that you had Perumal Murugan a few weeks ago, and that was wonderful because Perumal Murugan actually spent some weeks with us here in Manipal, and he actually attended a class where we taught his book, and he kept turning around, and this is not it's Pyre. Pyre was how it was translated into English, and he kept saying, but does the Tamil change when the person goes from the village to the city? And I said, no, in English, you can't capture that change. It's very hard. So these are the nuances of translation you're looking at, right? Because in English, it kind of flattens out. It's just one kind of, English. Whereas all the variations of, say, Tamil or Hindi or all of that, and how do you communicate that in English, right? So these are very traditional problems of translation. And I think I think what I'm saying is students should be, I think, involved in that conversation. So please don't look at the translation as, certainly mine as any kind of finished sort of piece, but people should come, read the Hindi, read the English, then argue about words. I think, I imagine this is already happening, but, if it's not, I think it should. I'm very happy to be told I've used words wrongly and, this is inappropriate, or, this has to be updated, the language. Because even how words age is itself very interesting. So when Snehal translated Shekhar he had sent me a draft, and somewhere he'd written cookies, and I had written, okay, yes, I've got a comment on the chat box. Yeah, so Snehal is translating Agya Shekhar, and he said cookies, and I said nobody in India says cookies, and you say biscuit or something. But then I realized that at least some of my students actually are okay with cookies because of the amount of American TV people watch nowadays, right? So you have to look at how these words there's also kind of Indian English you have to translate it into, which is not, British English or not, um, American English. So these are actually, again, these are not problems, but these are actually something that, for me, for a lot of students, enhance the experience, right? Okay. So what I'm saying is, vis-a-vis that paper, it's one thing to say, let us pick poems from all the languages and give representation. But I think for me, the deeper question also, as we're all engaging with this in a scholarly manner, is to look at how do we talk about Indian literature as a whole, right? Beyond just saying it's Indian literature and we should study it because we're Indians. So my second book was actually on this. I'm not trying to particularly promote it, but in terms of the sense of like what I was engaging with, right? Because it's this idea of how across languages there is this conversation. And I felt it was limited. I mean, if you want to stay with the language, that's the dominant trend of scholarship in India and I think abroad. That's fine. But sometimes it's very, because Hindi literature was so influenced, for example, by say Bangla literature, especially if you read the Premchand, Jainendra letters, they were kind of obsessed with it. And again, that's how does one capture those qualities in, say, a translation, like a Hindi poem that is trying to mimic a Tagore poem or is being positively inspired. So Nirala, for example, read a lot of Tagore and was somewhat obsessed with him. How do I translate Nirala in a way that I can also hear the echoes of Tagore, right? So these are very fascinating questions about translation. And I think this is what, conversation about translation should be, right? When we talk about Muktibodh. So Anshuman, can you give me a sense of how much you want me to talk? It's 4:30 now. What's the ideal? I'll work around it.
Another 20 minutes?
20
Okay.
30 minutes.
Okay.
30
Yeah.
minutes will be fine.
Yeah. We are
Okay,
not
no.
so pressed for time. I mean,
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. If it's useful, I'm happy to go on. I don't want to be not useful. Okay. Thank you. So yeah, I will give it. I also want to hear others speak. So I think those are the kind of, when we teach translation, I don't. I'm always because I remember studying in DU, and I felt like a lot of the teachers now, when I look back, felt this pressure to squeeze meaning out of a play, and we had some kind of sad Shakespeare plays, and there was not that much to that play. You read it, it's fun, and then there's not much to say about it. And now I think, how did they teach me that for a whole semester or a whole year? There really isn't that much to say. So I feel like to really get a sense of it's a good sort of quest to be on, to really have some sort of sense of modern Indian literature as a whole across languages in terms of themes, because they're not that different from each other. A lot of what, if you're talking about, say, Muktibodh, that generation in which Muktibodh is a part of, or even a slightly older generation, essentially, of course, they had some access to traditional, poetry. They had some access to Sanskrit. I'll talk about that more. But in terms of what they were reading of British literature, for example, and it was mostly British at that point. There weren't that many translations. What's interesting is how it's such a compressed timeline, right? They're discovering Wordsworth, and they barely discovered him when they discover Eliot. And that makes for a fascinating kind of telescoping. And I think I've written a little bit about it, but others have also. And that's the kind of, how now one has to account for an aesthetic of that telescoping. And that's a little bit what's happening with Muktibodh, right? I'll read out parts of a paper later, which I did for, as I mentioned, Dr. Purvanand. But that's what you have to account for, right? That he is actually rediscovering everybody at the same time. And this is the same thing if you're looking at Kannada literature or Tamil literature. This is the same issue with everybody. They're discovering both romanticism and modernism together, and they don't have that 120-year gap between it. So this makes for a kind of new take on it at the very least, right? Okay. So if this paper that I'm seeing and I'm trying to understand the rationale for it, I would say that I don't know, and I'd like to hear from them in terms of the use of scholarship in secondary literature. But I would certainly very much, certainly here the way I do it, students by the third year for sure are reading scholarly work and are responding to it, and we go back and forth, and we do a lot of reading in languages. So the Priyamvada Gopal book, again, these are names I'm sure you'll know, but we actually read a lot of we actually read the stories out, and it's wonderful because I mean, I'm sure even more than Manipal, you probably have a student from that language, right, who could just read that poem out, right? And it's important to hear it, and then you'll realize that actually even orally a lot of these languages are similar to each other, because they take a lot from, there's a lot of, whether it's from Sanskrit or Farsi or whatever it is, there is, when Indian languages have a kind of oral, like sibling relationship to a fair extent, right? So I would intersperse it with the scholarly and the primary, and I would do a lot of actual language reading. And we have these Pasha kind of clubs. These are mostly student organized, where they come and they read short stories, 2, 3, and they first just read it in that language, and then they translate it so that people get a feeling for these sort of languages. Okay, so I don't want to rehearse the older history of the scholarship around this, but you should know, and people should read. And so my teacher, Professor Vasudha Dalmia, her work, and then Francesco Orsini's, all of these are names you'll should know. They've given it's a very good historical kind of introduction to the milieu. And so Dr. Orsini's work, the first public sphere work ends in sort of 1930, and so you have a very good sense of that period. Of course, so much more ought to be done. And Hindi, as even Anshuman said, is very vast. It has many, ideally there should be, history, Hindi in Allahabad is different from Hindi in, Kanpur, different from Benares. And these are all of different centers, and they became important at different points. If you read something like Harivansh Rai Bachchan's autobiography, which is a marvelous book and translated, you can see how different cities become important at different points, different institutions, the university rises as a kind of space, right? And all this is important to Muktibodh because, he's somebody who struggled with just livelihood, struggled with, with being a teacher, and struggled with, the textbook controversy and all of these. So I feel he was somebody who was very much of an autodidact, who learned and, at great peril to himself. And so, his struggles, these institutional struggles are not abstract. They very much are part of his sort of milieu, right? Okay. So broadly speaking, the scholarship is either historical, which you should know, and which one can read historians. Is Charu Gupta has written on Hindi literature, from the historian from Delhi University, and you have again, these are not so hard to teach to my mind. If I, in a couple of 3, 4 classes, if you're talking about 5, 6 hours, you can really do modern Hindi in terms of context and background. So the rise of a kind of standardized Hindi, the break sort of split with Urdu, and the attempt to kind of craft a kind of Hindi, a modern Hindi prose, right? This is the great quest of, Dwivedi and all of these people at the turn of the century. So if you go to the Hindi department, they teach it in the somewhat grand way of the age of Bharathendu and the age of Dwivedi and the age of Shukla and all this. So this can be said fairly sort of simply. It's not that complicated. You're trying to, there's poetic language, but Hindi prose is, of course, essentially from the late 19th century, as it is for most Indian languages. Some are a little earlier, some are a little later. But essentially, you have only Hindi prose by the turn of the century in the sort of, and that's maybe why a lot of us struggled, who are not sort of native Hindi speakers. Why we struggle is because in some ways it is a sort of a construct, right? The construct doesn't make it not real or not authentic or anything, obviously, but it is something that kind of standardized Hindi is only a product of the late 19th, early 20th century. And so what I'm trying to say is someone like Muktibodh's poetry comes only out of that, right? You can't have it, right? It's not a kind of a language that was accessible before that, right? So the poetic language till the late 19th century is much more likely to be something like Braj, right? If you want to be traditional, as we know from our Hindustani music and all of that. But this kind of poetry and the very different like oral quality it had is because it is sort of bouncing off the baseline of a kind of different kind of modern standard Hindi, right? Okay. So so I think these, these uh, so I know there's a lot of problems with the semester system, so I'd like to hear more because it sort of works for us, maybe because we're different, very different context. But I feel like if you're teaching these, you know, if you give a couple of classes, you give a history of the sort of modern Hindi and the sort of standardization of Hindi prose into the kind of Hindi we read today. You know, so Alok Rai has written on it, right? And all of the older Gyan Pandey and all of the historians also written about this. I think then people will get, okay, this is the kind of idea of Hindi. And Hindi then becomes a somewhat different language from the other Indian languages because it is suddenly aware that it is the language of the majority of people. It has all these claims about being a sort of national, official, whatever. Sort of there is a somewhat of it becomes political very quickly, to put it bluntly, and and so again, this is something we can, students will understand, right? And so by the 20s is when you have fluent kind of writing of that. And so there's that generation of the, what are called, not, these are not very helpful terms, but chayavad and all of that, which are essentially derived as they very acknowledged. They were very obsessed with the romantics. They loved their Keats and Shelley and all of that, and they tried to write it like that. So there was that. But what they often also more promoted was the idea was this was a way of going back to a very traditional idea of Hindi and a kind of Sanskritic tradition. So you have people like Prasad, right? So this whole Kamayani and all these very long poems, which are like some sort of modern Purana. The Puranas in modern Hindi prose, if you like, or modern Hindi poetry, right? So that is the kind of intellectual quest of a certain kind of generation. And Muktibodh comes from the generation after that, which doesn't kind of believe, or that kind of holism of tradition is not possible anymore. So that's my understanding of it, right? So I'm just looking at my notes. So I think we can get to a point. This is relevant for most languages. If, like the historians do, you could just have a kind of ancient, medieval, modern India kind of thing. And if you uh, I think your syllabus also has some Shakuntala kind of stuff somewhere else. And I imagine putting that syllabus together was even more chaotic. But what I'm saying is, I do feel like it's incumbent a little bit on us as people in maybe the literature department teaching Indian literature and have some interest in teaching it without it being, jingoistic in any way. If we're interested in Indian literature, we should be able to have some kind of overall theoretical, like basic platform on which to sort of mount this. So we should be able to have like a pre-modern and a modern literature at the very least, right? And then the stories of the languages diverge a little bit, but not that much. It's essentially a lot of it is a response to a lot of European sort of poetry, right? A lot of Western poetry, and that's fine. We're not. There's no anxiety of influence, at least as far as I see it. It's only to the good, and so very much that they can. I think if you like Muktibodh and if you feel like he's been successful, the whole point is that he's very much assimilated a lot of these influences and done something new and valuable with it, right? So he's taken a lot of these ideas, but he's taken it to sort of new spaces. Okay, so the last thing the last segment, I'll stick to the time given, is really this thing that I wrote for on the I'll write it here. Uh, so this got actually translated. So I was very flattered. Some professor from BHU essentially translated this essay, and it became a kind of because it was all in Hindi, and I my Hindi is certainly not good enough to write in Hindi. And the argument, so I'll do a little bit of that. I hope this book is available. And then I'll sort of end with it. So So it's actually the title of the paper is called The Inner Horizon of Words. And I'll just take a few highlights from it. And the point I want to make is that, yeah, I mean, I'm certainly not an expert. I have no particular desire to be, and I'm not, I'm more interested in sort of the larger sort of question about the predicaments of, Indian literature in vis-a-vis a lot of questions. So I'm not beyond the point. Translation doesn't interest me as a question in itself. I know it's a scholarly subfield, and there are lots of good writing. Tejaswini Niranjana's book from the 90s, and the many subsequent books. But for me, and this is something maybe you all have opinions about. Some people, that's a bit of an end point, the conversation around translation. For me, in a way, less so. So like I showed from my second book, I was interested in, let's say, forms of subjectivity or subjectivation. And so it's a theoretical question which is not reducible to language in a way, right? But for those for whom language is in some way you're interested in the untranslatability of certain words and concepts, that's totally fine. If that's your method, that's great. So this paper I'd written was so I compared it essentially to that sort of quest for tradition, because what is interesting about Muktibodh, I should talk more directly, maybe I've been kind of going around it, and the language, which I don't know if you got, and I think Anshuman said kind words about the translation, about the Latinate, all of that, is that Muktibodh, for someone who was very broadly speaking of the left in the broadest sense of the word, they were asked to write very simple language, right? Because the whole idea was it was all about, intelligibility, and everyone should understand it, and to the last, man, woman, child, whatever. And but Muktibodh's language is actually pretty, difficult, and it's very sort of Sanskritic mostly, right? And even though it is very sharp, like I said, it's got that strong address. It has much that is colloquial, and he likes the colloquial word when it's put aptly. But like Agya, in this he was similar. The register is often somewhat lofty and Sanskritic. And so I was interested in that idea of trying to relate to tradition, and I contrasted it with so Jai Shankar Prasad did the same thing with Kamani, writing this long sort of narrative poem, and you have this in English, to whatever extent you care for it, or Aurobindo, Savitri, and so the nationalist movement had a lot of these kinds of grand poems. Maitri Sharan Dinkar, all these people wrote these long poems, and they were like retellings of the Ramayana, or the Ramayana from some different perspective, and things like that. And so there was that claim that as we get independence, this tradition will also it's a rebirth of a certain kind of tradition. And I want to show, so I'll just read a little bit the highlights of it, and you'll see that how, in a way, Muktibodh is sympathetic to that question in terms of, say, some of the questions about language and the use of a kind of Sanskritic register, and the refusal, in a way, to use overly simplified language. But then what he does with it is to show that the Brahmarakshas figure itself is somebody who's deeply wounded, and someone deeply flawed, and someone vulnerable, and someone defiled, and so that tradition is not something that I can immaculate. It's not an immaculate reconception, if you like, right? It is actually something that literally, if you look at Muktibodh, if you look at his poetry visually on the page, the fact that it's so scattered and fragmented, shows, I think, that kind of that jaggedness, that jarringness, right? So a few points about it, then I will shut up. Um, so if you contrast that quest, so for me, it's not about who's traditional, who's modern, and tradition and modernity can kind of get a bit sterile as a debate. But more that a lot of different people are interested in negotiating tradition, and they get to different places with that negotiation. And obviously, one is not superior to the other or anything like that. Maybe Prasad was actually the deeper poet, who knows? But it's still useful. Comparison is a way of understanding both figures here. So so you have this sort of figure of so by the time they come to the modern world, you have very much a different kind of psychology, so to speak, right? Something much more, in a way that I guess Jaishankar Prasad couldn't have been quite that invested in that notion of extreme sort of alienation and that kind of extreme solitariness and that kind of that the sense of being really cut off, right? The tradition is there, but it's almost mocking. So the Brahma Rakshas, evocation of tradition, he's sitting there, he's chanting these words, but it's because it's almost become a quote unquote a kind of madness, right? It is not a tradition that's available, right? So it is a kind of it is not accessible, it is mutilated, right? And I talk a little bit about the engagement with Sanskrit poetics in some ways. Uh, it's I don't want to. It's a complicated. I don't want to go into it. I've written about it elsewhere also. But some of the Sanskrit Prasad theory and all of that, because it was important to Muktibodh and to Prasad, some of it's useful because some of the rasas include, as the bibhatsa and things like that, which are actually about the grotesque, about the bizarre. So if you have modernity, it can be accommodated through some of those affects, right? And I think that's a useful way, in a way, to think about it, right? So he's claw-fingered, right? Brahma Rakshas shows a certain kind of mutilation, shows a certain kind of animality. He's so alienated, right? And there is this mapping of the inner and the outer. So it's not just interiority and not just psychological, but it is about how that inner world mirrors the outer world. Because the reason why I think Anshuman also mentioned this, Muktibodh became important during the emergency and during very trying political times, is that psyche, the inner psyche, is mirrored by the tanks that are there in the city center at night, so to speak, right? So there is this always this mirroring of this inner collapse, breakdown with the kind of outer dystopia. So I think the most sophisticated psychological writing is when you're able to do that kind of mirroring, and there's that breaching of the inner and the outer. It's not just purely private grief, but it also has this kind of external echo, right? So you look at so some of this tradition, and this is how in my book on the Hindi novel, you can see Premchand is not quite understanding where Jainendra and Agya are going, because they're taking the novel to sort of psychological levels that he's uncomfortable with, and he'd feel like, I don't understand, why are they pushing it, why are they going on about extramarital affairs or incest or things like that. So to here you can see someone like Prasad, not I don't think he directly commented on Muktibodh, but one can see that they're saying, okay, this is a new generation of poets who are pushing ideas that they have taken and inherited from us, but are pushing it into realms that are very, very sort of far more than we have conceived, right? Taken it somewhere even more bizarre, even more grotesque. And the last point I want to make is this is more speculative in my essay, but there are these very beautiful letters that actually Muktibodh wrote with his friend Nemi Chandra Jain, who is also an important Hindi literature, and he talks all about this deep unhappiness of just family life, and there's no livelihood issues, incompatibility in some ways with the wife, marital difficulty, which and things like that. So I just wonder that sometimes, Muktibodh, there's a certain comfort in a kind of very metaphysical, cosmological language. It's all about the atom bomb. The atom bomb had, Hiroshima wasn't long back, and so there's a sense of nuclear catastrophe. But a lot of it is, it's sometimes more acceptable to write about the destruction of the world and the world blowing up than to talk about more mundane unhappiness, right? The unhappiness of just marriage, or the unhappiness of livelihood, and the frustrations of livelihood, and frustrations of teaching and things like that. So which we all know a little bit. So I was saying that it's a high register, it's highly a Sanskritic register, it's a cosmological register, but maybe the sources are actually quite everyday and mundane and almost banal, but that's what makes it so sort of insidious. So even in the Brahma Rakshas poem, there are these grotesque figurations, but actually the kind of life that the reason we feel a kinship is because even in a very bourgeois middle class kind of life, one can feel that kind of that scream in the night, so to speak, that no one can hear of. And I think this is it's a for me, that's something to think about. It's a very different formal way of approaching it than contemporaries like Beckett or someone who's exactly contemporary to this kind of writing, right? A lot of European, these are very contemporary movements, existentialism in the broad sense. But I think these can be sources of very fertile like comparison. So I feel like, again, Indian literature shouldn't be seen as it should be rerouted into a kind of your world literature also when needed, when it's relevant and when it's apt. So I think that would be also a way of teaching it. So thank you for your time and patience. And I'm happy to. It doesn't have to be comments necessarily. Just I'm be happy to just hear. Sorry, it doesn't have to be questions. Any just comments, or I'm happy to share my thoughts on it. In fact, I'm not always happy with the questions because I don't feel I can do justice to it. So if we're just sharing ideas, I'm happy to do that. So thank you all again for patiently listening. Yes.
Thank you, Nikhil, for this wonderful lecture. You actually covered quite a lot of ground, actually, this short span of time. So I'll just kind of begin with the last point you actually made, which I found very interesting. That a kind of you referred to Muktibodh's personal troubles in his personal life, and yes, he has some references, but very interestingly, he talks about them, as you rightly pointed out, to Naimichan Jain. I mean, in his letters to Naimichan Jain and Shrikant Verma, I think, the two friends that he shared his life with. Yes, it's a very interesting reading that you give, that sometimes it's better to write about issues which are internationalist and in scope and the troubles in the nation than to talk about small things of life. It's a very different point, because generally Hindi criticism, right, when it talks about Muktibodh's propensity to talk about the big issues that plagued societies in society in 1950s and 60s. And generally, when I'm talking about Hindi criticism, most of this criticism on Muktibodh, strangely, as usually it happens with most of the writers of the left, let's say. And Muktibodh was definitely on the left. He was a member of the Communist Party of India as well. So, in fact, he died much before the split. So he had not seen it. The most of the criticism is focused on how great a life writer. I mean, it's a kind of hagiography of Muktibodh generally. In fact, what I've seen is that there's a kind of distinct discomfort that these left critics of Muktibodh feel when you talk about such issues. For instance, Muktibodh's own explanation I found was very interesting. For instance, several times in his essays, which I find something very interesting, because they illuminate, as you rightly pointed out in your lectures, but they illuminate a lot of in his poetry. So he keeps on saying that there is one problem plaguing Hindi literature after Premchand, which is he calls it in Hindi, the word that he uses in Hindi. I don't know how to translate it. I think you do a better job. He says it's Vyaktivad. There's constantly this thing about Vyaktivad that he talks about in many of his essays. And he says that this is what plagues literature. And in one of his essays, which is a kind of loving kind of reappraisal of Premchand, and the essay is called "Meri maa ne mujhe Premchand se pyar karna sikhaya," something like that, right? Okay, in which he talks about the simplicity of the mother, how her mother was very simple, and the father was this upright namak ka daroga kind of figure. Again, the reference to Premchand. In fact, his mother said that your father is like namak ka daroga, he's so honest. Police wala being honest, and Premchand, of course, Muktibodh had deep distrust of all the institutional structures of colonial India, including the police. So he says that I wish we could return to the simplicity of Premchand's time. I mean, there is there is a deep feeling that there's a kind of lost innocence. That after Premchand, the writers, including Jainendra and again more than Jainendra probably, because Jainendra was, after all, he was supposed to be the bearer of the Premchand, the tradition of Premchand ki parampara. But again, of course, was like kind of, and at the same time, Muktibodh also says that he actually ended up being the poet of experimentalism, right? That is of Hindi modernism. So he's kind of lost in that contradiction, that he wishes for that kind of desire for a larger social kind of perspective, and yet he himself is constantly lost in this Vyaktivad, which he actually is deeply critical of in his prose works, but in his poetry is constantly referring to himself and I. That the romantic idiom, in a way modernized or modernized in a way, kind of. I find it very interesting because this is what the left critics focus on. It's so what you have pointed out is this kind of escape from uh, the kind of mundane realities of life. But insofar as Muktibodh was concerned, I feel strongly that for Muktibodh, I mean, insofar as he thinks, these mundane realities were largely social in nature. He had this kind of longing for the kind of mundane reality that Premchand talked about, and the new mundane realities which you actually have focused on. Which actually many of the writers of the 1950s, Bharat Bhushan Agrawal, and then the great writers of the 1960s, all those very interesting movements that came about, the Akahani Andolan in Hindi, so short story, and then there is Nai Kavita, which started from the late 1950s, and kind of reached this kind of climax in the late 1960s. They were constantly talking about these, the problems of personal relationships, although they are probably talking more in deeply patriarchal terms. Most of these writers and women writers have not come into being that much, and most of these writers are talking about how the relationships are failing, and that's what Muktibodh is, is kind of hates. In most of his essays, he's constantly talking about how he hates the Vyaktivad of these writers, and he wishes for those simpler times, those far more times in which social commitment and political commitment were the mainstay of a writer's writerliness in a way. So I don't know what to say. I mean, this is a comment. I mean, what do you think? I mean, is it like Muktibodh's is full of these very interesting contradictions, which cannot be resolved in his own time? And he's one of those writers because he consciously identifies on the left. At the same time, in one of his last essays in 1964, this is a letter actually addressed to the General Secretary of the CPI. That's the letter to Dange, in which he says that I'm sorry to say, sir, but I'm just translating it roughly. I'm read it in Hindi. So I'm sorry to say, sir, but you people have been very cruel to writers of Nai Kavita and Nai Kahani. And you people, because of your adverse and brutal criticisms, writers have moved more towards Vyaktivad and a kind of reactionary kind of impulse instead. And so, maybe Marxist critics should, in fact, he's very much involved in critiquing Vyaktivad, and at the same time, when others are doing it, he's also very critical of that approach. He feels that that the party line, kind of Zadanovian kind of party line, that you can see emerging in the Communist Party of India by the time it reached 1960s, right? And the kind of extreme criticism of Nehru that leads to the split in the Communist Party, that actually is already evident. He's saying this kind of orthodoxy that is kind of grabbing, literary attention, and is kind of constantly, it's kind of hijacking literary criticism as such, Hindi literary criticism of writers who actually at least are trying to talk about their times, the newly emerging problems of the times. So there's this kind of huge contradiction in his own desires, this love for Premchand and his love for that kind of socially committed writing, which is that kind of orthodoxy of the contemporary left, because everybody would like to write like Premchand, but none of them is able to write like Premchand, and this kind of thing. So what I mean, it's just a kind of observation. You can, if you would like to elaborate upon it.
Yeah. Thanks, Anshuman. I think so. I think that the easier, broader historical point may be useful, which as you've alluded to also, which is that so Premchand died in 1936, right? So you have the 30s is a little bit the golden age of the left, right? Certainly in retrospect. So if you look at famously like the Spanish Civil War, you could see that actually it was very black and white in a very simple way, and all the good so-called good guys on one side, and the the fascists or whatever on the other side. And there's a book by Francois Furet, for example, on this. And so when Premchand died, it seemed a very ascendant kind of philosophy. But after that, it becomes very complicated very quickly with the rise of Stalin and with the Stalin-Hitler pact and the World War. And so the disillusionment with the left is as old as the left itself. So this is an important, I think, to my mind, an important point, right? Like certainly, even the 1917 event is sort of, ambivalent to say the least. And but certainly post Stalin, it becomes deeply ambivalent. And so by the time you come to India, that disillusionment is quite strong from quite early on. And so none of these people, none of the artists were very comfortable with this. And so not at all surprising that letter to Dange and all of that kind of orthodoxy and and in the 50s, you had the invasion, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, all these things that were happening in the 50s, 60s. So I think that kind of orthodox left was fraying, and and one could argue it was always fraying. And even if you look at some Althusser, it's like 1917 is okay, but 21 onwards it's declining. So it doesn't matter after a point. Like the decline is, alongside the good, the faith. So I think that's a useful way of thinking about it. So Premchand could believe in a kind of almost innocent. So those are marvelous letters. I've quoted from them often. When he's right, Jainendra, Premchand letters, because you could see Premchand that there is a kind of innocence. There is a kind of innocence that is no more possible, and and social justice is an easy kind of phrase, but what exactly it means concretely is getting harder and harder to define at any level. And what you talked about, the Nai Kahani movement, you're right, that they are the ones who were able to write Mohan Rakesh and all of these people, and there was such a strong disillusionment, even in Nehruvian India in the 50s, from all sides of the spectrum, saying, it was not, this is not, of course, but, something like partition happened. So I think there is a kind of loss of faith. Premchand and that generation, that, the 20s, 30s were some sort of, golden age of simple faith. It was very quickly disabused of, and other problems which couldn't be accommodated, came. And so the left was progressive on many issues, of course, but also not. And I remember my teacher, Dr. Dalmia, saying about, because some of these people are still alive, right, who were of that party of that time. They would say things like, yes, the Communist Party, for example, would very much allow people to marry from different castes and communities, and they encouraged it. But she talked about someone else who said, but you can't then divorce people, right? Like, okay, you married out of caste, fine, we are progressive. Firstly, you have to get married. And, so what I'm saying is, there are limits to how progressive you can be. This is only common sense to some extent, right? So great that you've married out of religion or caste or whatever. But now that you have to stick to this person, you have to be married, all of this. So there is that disjunct between your personal life and between these ideals. And people, found it very hard to negotiate it. And so I think this is something that, even in Muktibodh, right, even if there's some, the Russian Revolution doesn't solve problems of marriage and divorce and custody and livelihood and, all kinds of other things. So I think it is a bitter decade in a way, I would say, from the 50s onwards. And so Premchand dying in 1936 is, he could still be very, very, imagine the revolution was still intact, but it wasn't. And I think it's, as literature scholars, for me, certainly, it's more productive to see that disillusionment also at the heart of the illusion or the enchantment of these kinds of ideas. So yes, thank you. I see there's a bunch of questions on the side. Should I just?
Yeah, absolutely. There's the question.
I'm not sure I understand everything, but so this is okay.
Mini, I think.
So there are 3 questions, I think, so far.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. So thank you, sir. Was Mukti?
Yeah.
Okay. The first question, Mukti poetry name. Yeah. Okay. I'm not very sure I follow that. I might need help with that question. Okay. So I think some of these questions of freedom, maybe broadly, political freedom, personal freedom, sexual freedom, all of those kinds of things. Muktibodh is not his, his name. It was kind of a, sort of a pseudonym. And so he was, but I think it's sort of a grand name. And so I think that's interesting in it to have that kind of name. And so, yes, he deals with all of these questions of freedom, both personal, political, all of that. And so the word Vyaktivad, for example, I think a mini paper can be written on exactly what he meant, because it's something of a neologism. He has sort of little bit coined it, or it's been coined around this time. You can see it's a translation of, a kind of word, but it's also a bit of a stick to beat people. If you don't like someone, you say, okay, it's too Vyaktivad for me, So we have to see how different people use it, because it's saying, oh, it's too bourgeois or it's too individualistic or something like that, right? So it would be useful as a smaller minor paper on Muktibodh would be to see how he uses that kind of word and just what his ideas of freedom are to understand that first question, the idea of liberation. Bizarre on the average around. Okay, so the next question, let me look at it. Yeah, so when I say bizarre, immoral, and what I mean to say is, you're pushing the envelope a little bit on what is acceptable. So you have to remember. So this was part of the ideas, and I've written a little bit about this in my book. With Premchand, for example, you can actually see it quite clearly, right? Because it happens fast. You're making a case in the 20s, even to make a case for a companionate marriage, right? A marriage for love, so to speak, is radical, right? Because you're expected to marry, arranged marriage and things like that, right? So Premchand is very puzzled. Why does Jainendra write about, say, extramarital affairs, right? He's like, we've not even got to a stage where we are having marriage out of love, and now you've made it like extramarital affairs. Now in Shekhar, it's almost like almost a kind of incestuous relationship, right? So this idea of pushing the envelope, if you call it bizarre, immoral, whatever. I mean, there's some, if you're sympathetic to it, of course, if you're like Premchand just didn't get it, and he didn't get it till he died, I think. Here too, you are, when you say bizarre, immoral, presumably that's because they felt like even the companionate marriage is not quite capturing the kind of notion of, say, personal or romantic freedom that we have. So there's a constant little bit pushing of the envelope, which every generation kind of has to do. So, I don't know what Mukti poetry is, and maybe there's some confusion, but what I'm saying is certainly the idea of, when we say bizarre, immoral, we put it in quotes as you have, and we have to say, okay, how are these changing ideas of marriage? How is the idea of marriage changing? So it's quite a jump to move from just, say, a caste compatible marriage, which would be a standard marriage, even up to today, to saying marrying out of love, and now saying actually making a sort of case like Jainendra does in Sunita with a kind of extramarital affair. It seems somewhat gratuitous also. It's not even like, the husband is evil in any obvious way or anything like that, right? So how are you talking about divorce? So yes, immoral in quotes, and immoral in the name of a certain kind of personal sort of sexuality, right? And then there's a question on, okay. Yes, thanks for putting the translation of, yeah, I think Dr. Abhagupta is the right person. And there's a question on dissociates itself from PWA. Yeah, so I would, this is the question, Yamini S. Yeah, I would actually avoid these terms, right? Arts for art's sake, because I don't think, I mean, it's formulated in a very particular late 19th century, British context. So I think people are always trying to put little bit brackets, labels, so I don't think Agya was art for art's sake, right? You're just trying to say he is like this and the other person's like that. So I would submit that, you read Agya on his own terms, as I try to do in actually in both my books, and then say, and it's a different kind of politics, and Muktibodh has a different kind of politics, and there's a different ratio, if you like, between the personal and forms of subjectivation and forms of action in the world and different kinds of politics. So so even these terms, when it's okay to say prayogvad and all of these terms, but more like, okay, what do you mean by those terms? Like otherwise they're just labels which are not very precise. So So I think it's useful to say, if you read carefully, like I try to, people don't put Prasad and Muktibodh in the same bucket. And I've tried to do it in this sort of paper, precisely because I want to juxtapose people who are not traditionally put together. And, I think if Muktibodh is broadly, on the left or whatever, to whatever extent, again, it's not a matter of self-attestation, him saying it or declaring it or buying the ticket or whatever, paying the subscription fee. It's more like, okay, but what does these ideas of justice mean for him, right? So I think, and him through the work and through the diversity of work. So it's great to, for me, it's great if you read letters and if you read all these other things, because often the letters are more interesting and more honest in some ways. So I feel like instead of just getting stuck on labels, it's again like this is like this is prayogvad, this is that vad. Okay, what do these words mean in the oeuvre that is being discussed? So even to track what he means by, Vyaktivad over 10 years would be fascinating. So Greg has done some work on these kind of conversations on art, and, so, I mean, he's someone, I don't know if his book is out yet, but certainly the dissertation is available. And in the same book, there is I think this was referred to, this Agye modernism book, so Hindi modernism, which is on Agye because 2011 was his 100 years, so he's a bit older. But there's some stuff on Muktibodh also. And then, of course, I reference the Dr. Purvanand book. And so I think, I think to treat these writers respectfully is to really see how they use words. Sometimes you don't have to buy their argument for the way they use a word, because the way they use it in 1962 is different from 48, right? So I think the more nuanced the reading is, the more you will very carefully parse what they mean by these words. As it's changing, as they are aging, as the historical context is changing, all of that, right? So I think if you keep all those in mind, then you'll have a good sense of what these words mean to them, instead of taking these words for granted. Thank you. Yes, thank you. Yeah, the Greg Golding dissertation is out there. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
I think there is a question on what was the reason that Muktibodh used Sanskrit aesthetics in his poetry. I think that's one of the questions. Huh?
Yeah, okay, yes, correct. Sorry, I didn't catch that. Yeah, so I think, well, your guess is as good as mine, of course. But I think what was interesting, it's an interesting move, right? Because at that point, and actually nobody's kind of quite done it. I mean, again, people here are more knowledgeable than me. Even after that, right? All the major Hindi poets, actually nobody quite used it in quite that way. And Sanskrit, I don't know aesthetics, but Sanskrit, vocabulary. Because certainly the trend in modern Hindi has been towards a kind of simplification. And there's a kind of, we sort of mock the Doordarshan kind of Hindi in a way, right? So the trend has very much been towards, communication and ease of communication and kind of everyday Hindi and colloquial Hindi. And if there is a specialization of Hindi, I suspect it's much more regional. So, the Hindi in Benares is different from the Hindi in, Delhi or whatever, right? And how it's inflected by Urdu or Braj or things like that. So, so I think the fact that Muktibodh, I'd love to see a good work on the Maharashtrian Marathi influence, and Dhananjay is here, but and even in terms of the milieu that he worked with. So the fact, I don't know why he used it. There's no what is the reason, but he did use it, and he did use a lot of Sanskrit words. I think it's because I think because he found it very rich and potent. Of course, he used it to ends which were maybe not so Sanskritic, but the Sanskritic tradition is also long and complicated and ambivalent and very rich. It's millennia long. So so you'll have to tell me how he used it, but he certainly used it to very original ends, I think, towards doing something very different. Because how else would you, what are your options in Hindi, right? Like if you're talking about bhasha, so to speak, you're very influenced to some extent. You talk about Nirala and Bangla, for example, or you talk about, as you go to, Eastern UP and Bihar, and, so it's inflected in a certain way with those sort of languages. It changes in Delhi, it's inflected by Urdu. Then, of course, there's a kind of colloquial. Then, of course, nowadays with English. So when a poet or writer chooses how to inflect the language, there's a lot of, there's obviously a lot of thought. There's a reason why he or she is doing it. And I think that's worth tracing. But this was something that, persisted throughout. And this is true, like Agya too did it. And maybe it's a dead moment in Hindi literature. I don't know enough about what's happening right now, but I wouldn't say it is necessarily dead. I would be very interested if someone starts doing it again, because I think it can be done. But you have to be careful how you do it, because it's easy to sort of misunderstand. And of course, one wants to avoid a certain kind of, like I said, a sort of very Doordarshan kind of Hindi also may not be very useful. Right. So it's more like not just Sanskrit vocabulary, but how you break it, how you fragment it, how you make it do new things. Right. And so I can't answer why he did it, but I think because he did it, the poetry had a lot of very interesting effects. And that's what I would track as a scholar or reader. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that interesting and extensive reply. I just was wondering, that generally in the way we interpret Hindi literature today, even today I've seen that there's a kind of uh, when we talk about Hindi, generally we center around basically the Doab region or Uttar Pradesh, to some extent a little bit of Bihar, to some extent Western UP. Muktibodh was primarily, I mean, he was located mostly in Madhya Pradesh, right? And in fact, he was one of those few writers who actually talked about some of the writers actually who were located in Madhya Pradesh. And to some extent, what I get from his writings is that he seems to be inclined to defend them from kind of criticism that was emerging from the main centers of Hindi, so as to speak, like Allahabad or Lucknow, or these places which were supposedly the traditional, the heavyweights of Hindi belt lived here, as opposed to Madhya Pradesh, where, of course, a lot of interesting Laghu Patrikas, as I mentioned earlier, came out from Madhya Pradesh as well, from Jabalpur and from even Bhopal. Even today, I mean, I've heard that that magazine Vasudha is still coming out, because it's both published in it. And there was Gyan Ranjan in he was a major writer of the 1960s. He was also located in Jabalpur, and he brought out this very interesting modernist magazine with a kind of very strong modernist focus. It's called Pahal. I mean, it kind of it was a pahal in the sense that it's an initiative in a way that it kind of was opposed to the mainstream left kind of magazines that was the mainstay of Hindi literature, and of course these most of the editors of these Laghu Patrikas were people who were either associated with the Communist Party, or they were sons of these some of these heavyweights, right? Like, for instance, you probably know that even today, there's a magazine that comes out from Delhi. It's called Naya Path, which is a kind of official kind of. It's just like you might have People's Democracy, in Hindi, right? I mean, literally People's Democracy, right? Okay, I mean that I've always felt that, and there was this very, very clear desire to erase any kind of voice, which was non-Marxist, or, and Pahal was this very interesting magazine. What I'm saying is that, do you think that staying away from some of these centers of traditional Hindi world, in a way, helped Muktibodh because he was already to some extent on the margins of what I call the Hindi belt, and therefore it was easier for him to be critical of the kind of mainstream left kind of Hindi establishment that was very strong in the 1950s, and because the left was strong politically speaking also compared to what the left is today. Now, of course, you have plenty of space to bring out any kind of magazine. I mean, like outrightly reactionary ones can be even brought out, and none would be the wiser, for that. But at that time it was pretty difficult, and the extreme courage that, in my view, Muktibodh showed when he wrote a letter to Dange, and was deeply critical of the kind of orthodoxy of critical orthodoxy that prevailed in those times. Does it have to be with this kind of spatial location? That's what I was thinking of. It is still again I'm thinking aloud. Yes.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I think, it's very plausible, and it's I would love, because there are students here. I mean, this is the kind of work I would really encourage, and maybe I can't do it, but maybe all of us are not that old also. But I would, I would love a good biography of, Muktibodh, and somebody just collects everything. I'd like to know what he thought. And he might have said a lot of things that you said. And I think, I someone who does a good, like, ethnographic kind of Jabalpur or whatever of the situation there, who really goes small town India, so to speak, right? Small town North India, small town, hinterland kind of, I think, I mean, he had access to also important people. I mean, he did. Uh, but uh, but I think, since I think Dhananjay is here, I think the Marathi connection is also very interesting to me. I don't know enough, and if maybe Dr. Dhananjay wants to say anything. But I think those are the sort of, that's exactly the kind of work that someone should do, because otherwise we are all somewhat speculating, and what you're saying is makes perfect sense. But I would love a very empirical, textual kind of work which shows that, which gives me a milieu of Jabalpur in the early 60s would be fabulous. Like what exactly is happening. And I talked about, we had Dr. Rakshanda Jalil stayed with us in Manipal for a few weeks, like last year, and we were talking about some of these things. And I said, so she asked about, she just come out with a biography of, I think someone was her uncle, right, the Urdu poet Shahryar, and I was just saying, what interests me most is the milieu, like, what is Aligarh in the 70s, or, you know, Benares in the 80s, whatever, that kind of semi-literary, if you like, institutional, anthropological, like that dense textured work would be lovely. I mean, it's been up to some extent updating of or the Orsini, Dalmia kind of work also, because they also wrote milieu kind of work. But I think that would be very helpful in understanding where these people came from, right? That kind of, if someone actually took the trouble to go there, look at the archives, bring out this kind of stuff. So when Muktibodh is, the frustrations, but also the opportunities of being far away from the center, and the kind of, so yeah, this is the kind of work that should be done. I feel like, I hope some student listening here, I mean, that's why we do these things. I think we hope that somebody will do that kind of work, because it's replicating today too, right? The centers haven't shifted. If you read the Harivansh Rai Bachchan, he bemoans the loss of power of Allahabad versus Delhi, for example. And so you can see, these centers keep shifting, and they have new formations and mutations. And if someone really tracking it, even up to the micro level of a Hindi department, the priorities of the Hindi department, it would be interesting in itself. So I would love this kind of work. It's been done in film studies with, S.V. Srinivas has done some wonderful work with the Telugu cinema, where he doesn't just look at cinema, but he looks at how that cinema is being consumed in a small town and, rural, Andhra Pradesh. So like, similarly, those kind of consumption based work, which I don't do at all, unfortunately, which is about how exactly people are reading, consuming, Hindi literature in a small town, reading these magazines. That kind of ethnography will also, I think, engage a lot more students, because then they won't feel like they just have to read these greatest hits by these great poets, So it would make it feel more real and more relevant. So thank you for that. That's the kind of work I think I would really like if someone did it.
I think we might have to close in about 5-7 minutes. Dhananjay, are you here? Do you want to say something? Respond to some of the questions?
No. I grew up reading the Marathi novelist Sharat Chandra Muktibodh. On my horizon, back in a small town in Maharashtra in the 70s and 80s, to be perfectly honest, Gajanan Madhav Muktibodh was famous as the brother of Sharat Chandra Muktibodh. So his trilogy, starting the socio-political cultural transformation in the first pre-independence decades of Maharashtra, Navi Malvat, Jana He Volatu Tethe, and the third one skipping my mind, right? And it's only when I came to Delhi and took classes with Harish Trivedi that I, in a way, discovered the great Gajanan Madhav Muktibodh. Greg Golding, in passing in his dissertation, does speak about the bilingual influences on Gajanan Madhav Muktibodh, and in some ways how modernism in Marathi poetry actually preceded modernism in Hindi poetry. Tar Saptak came out in 1943, but Balkrishna Sitaram Mardekar was writing modernist poetry in the 1930s. And especially the influence of the Second World War, Bombay as a cosmopolitan city is something that influences that generation of Marathi poets. And I was just talking to Yamini offline about this. Greg has this month published an article in Duke University Press Journal about the long poetry of Muktibodh, where since we live in this third world university, I don't have access to the entire article, but the abstract discusses how he wants, in the article, he's looking at the Marathi influence on Gajanan Madhav Muktibodh as well, right? So maybe Nikhil, using his Manipal connections, I mean, I can write to Greg myself, but it will be possibly faster if Nikhil can share the PDF with us. So yes, that work is being done. I unfortunately am too hard pressed fighting mundane syllabus battles here to go back and trace the interconnections between Marathi and Hindi at that level. But again, you know, I mean, what Muktibodh does in his theoretical writings, in his political writings, in his short and long poetry, and in fact, in his short stories. So I was asking my students to read Brahma Rakshas Ka Shishya, the short story along with Brahma Rakshas poem, right? And Muktibodh's incomplete novella, Vipatra, is again something that is absolutely fascinating, with references to Abelard and castration, and his haunting imagery of both an aspiration and a deep sense of guilt and dissatisfaction is ultimately something that drives all of his poetry. So it's not all of his works. So Satya Se Uthta Aadmi, the only full-length novel that he wrote, and its film version by Manikal, is again something that needs to be engaged with by any serious student of Muktibodh. I don't know whether in the semester system, with so much work to be done, students will be able to do that, but your education begins after your degree gets over. So hopefully that will continue.
Yes.
That's my do paisa worth.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yes.
Are we ready to close? Yeah.
Yeah. So
thank you so much,
thanks a lot.
Nikhil. Yeah, Nikhil, thank you very, very much for this absolutely wonderful conversation, and given us a lot to think about, especially, you know, about the conceptual filters and frameworks, you know, that we should be thinking about as teachers when we, you know, approach a paper like Indian writing in translation or Indian literature. And these things, I think, are central to our engagement with, you know, Indian writing in translation, because, you know, if you don't think about pedagogical practices, then, you know, it's all the same, isn't it? So that I found very, very useful, and something that we deal with. And it is a problem. It is definitely a problem. And we've not really come up with necessarily very viable alternatives or options, but it's the fun thing is to think about these issues. And I think that's what we are doing in the classroom.
So, yeah, may I ask, do your students, do they write papers, or how does it work? Do they write papers with thesis and defend? Is that the kind of?
They have to take an exam at the end of the semester. So it's the same thing. We do it twice over. It's the same thing, Nikhil, the exam system that we used to have, except that now they have 25 marks as internal assessment. So they do write papers as well. Short tutorials.
next year the 4-year program is coming, so there will be in the 4th year a research component in which people are supposed to write a short dissertation as well.
No, but is the paper like they have to like come up with an original thesis and defend it, that kind of writing,
Oh,
or
no,
it's more like question answer?
It's question answer.
It's just question answer. Absolutely.
Question answer. Yeah.
It's the
That might
same
be
that
the
we did.
challenge. That for me, that's really the heart of it, because even students who are not that good here, at least it's a bit different. They're forced to think. Otherwise, the question answer format for me, really, it's very hard to.
Yeah, it's quite, I mean, it's neither here nor there. It means nothing. Maybe, Nikhil, at some point, we can have a seminar or a discussion session with people who are teaching this paper, along with you, because you've been doing this in Manipal for a very long time. So it might be a good, idea for some of us to actually have a proper discussion where we think about, pedagogical practices and conceptual frameworks that, we can use when we are looking at Indian literature. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Anshuman. And it was wonderful
Thanks to all.
to hear, both of you have this fantastic conversation, and, it was really, really wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Antara, for
Thank you.
organizing this.
Yes.
Thank you. I enjoyed myself, and I'm happy to, if it's relevant, come again, because I mean, I think pedagogy, and actually I'm almost more interested in the pedagogy institutional, because if students don't write that kind of work, then it's a little bit, dead in the water. So I'd be happy to talk about it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for organizing this.
Thank you. Bye-bye.